whoever, knowing that an offense against the United States has been committed, receives, relieves, comforts, or assists the offender in order to hinder or prevent his apprehension, trial, or punishment is an accessory after the fact. This is what an accessory after the fact looks like. The breaking Republican criminal news of the day is that the Republican Speaker of the House is now actively trying to prevent arrests for the federal crime of attacking the Capitol on January 6th. The federal crime of accessory after the fact requires knowledge that a crime has been committed against the United States and that a person with that knowledge then, quote, assists the offender in order to hinder or prevent his apprehension, trial, or punishment. Now, keep those words in mind when you listen now to what Republican Speaker Mike Johnson said he is doing to the thousands of hours of security video that were recorded at the Capitol on January 6th before he makes all of that video publicly available.
We have to blur some of the faces of persons who participated in the events of that day because we don't want them to be retaliated against and to be charged by the DOJ.
Big smile. We don't want them to be charged by the DOJ. That is the first time in history that a Speaker of the House has said that he doesn't want people who committed federal crimes to be charged by the Department of Justice. That is the mission of an accessory after the fact. An accessory after the fact is trying to prevent the apprehension of criminals, trying to prevent the punishment of criminals. And Mike Johnson says, with that goofy smile, like he's a cultist in the middle of a cult, all of whom believe that we don't want the Justice Department to charge people after they commit federal crimes on videotape. And there's more.
That's a slow process to get it done. We're working steadily on it. We've hired additional personnel to do that.
Okay. All right. So the same Republican Speaker of the House who blocked funding for Israel by attaching cuts to the IRS workforce to that bill has hired additional federal workers whose job title should be accessories after the fact. Mike Johnson, who wants to fire IRS workers who investigate federal tax crimes, has hired new federal workers to cover up crimes. Mike Johnson is the most pro-crime speaker in the history of the House of Representatives. In fact, he's the only one who has ever publicly admitted to participating and leading a cover-up of federal crimes. The Speaker seems to think that he's not technically guilty of being an accessory after the fact because the Justice Department already has all of this video without any blurred faces of the Trump-crazed criminals attacking the Capitol. But the truth is, throughout the history of American law enforcement, citizens have been identifying criminals for law enforcement officials that the officials could not identify themselves. Citizens have been finding criminals for law enforcement that law enforcement could not find themselves. The FBI's most wanted list is 73 years old tonight. It was started in 1950. Some of the most famous criminals in history were on that list. Serial killer Ted Bundy. Osama bin Laden made the list years before 9/11. The FBI hope is that someone somewhere in the world will see one of these people on that list, see their picture, then see that person somewhere in the world and make a phone call, as has happened many, many, many times over the years. Hundreds of the Trump-crazed criminals who attacked the Capitol have been arrested only because they were identified by citizens who saw photographs of them or saw video of them and knew who they were or figured out who they were and alerted the FBI. Mike Johnson wants to prevent all of that. Mike Johnson wants to stop every one of those arrests that can still be made because an alert citizen makes a call to the FBI. He wants to stop possibly hundreds of arrests that could be made. Mike Johnson is better at lying than Donald Trump. Much, much, much better. Donald Trump has sounded like a liar every day of his life. He has never once sounded like anything but a pathological liar to me, going back decades before he became a politician. Mike Johnson sounds like your accountant telling you how much your mortgage deduction is going to be this year.
The release of the January 6 tapes is a critical and important exercise. We want transparency. We should demand that the American people do.
We want transparency. His face could not be straighter when he says that. Donald Trump would strain over a word like transparency if it appeared in his teleprompter and so obviously not mean what he was saying. But Mike Johnson, with his unthreatening accountant-like demeanor, delivers Trumpian lies without the fireworks, and he's going to be an active member of the Republican Party for decades after Donald Trump's funeral. Liz Cheney's new book reveals that she was shocked by Mike Johnson's advancing preposterous ideas before January 6th about not accurately counting electoral votes.
When I would confront him and tell him that his legal reasoning was inaccurate, was wrong, he would often, suggest that he agreed. And he did the same thing with Kevin McCarthy's chief counsel. He knew that he was making arguments for which he didn't have a basis, but he continued to do it. He was desperate in many ways for Donald Trump's approval, to be sort of in Donald Trump's inner circle.
Donald Trump's inner circle is a crime ring. Mike Johnson has no legal authority to blur the faces of the criminals in that video. That video does not belong to Mike Johnson. That video does not belong to the Republican Party. That video was created by and paid for by the United States Congress, a branch of the federal government, which means it is owned by the federal government, whose authority comes entirely from us, from voters. We all own that video. We paid for it. Mike Johnson is tampering with the people's video recorded in the people's house. This could never have happened before Donald Trump criminalized congressional Republicans, some of whom participated in Donald Trump's criminal plot before January 6th, and almost all the rest of whom have added their voices of support of that plot after the fact by refusing to vote for Donald Trump's impeachment after he led the January 6th attack. Special Prosecutor Jack Smith is now saying in court filings that he wants to use statements Donald Trump has made after the attack on the Capitol to prove Donald Trump's intent leading up to and during the attack on the Capitol. Jack Smith's court filing says, of particular note are the specific January 6th offenders whom the defendant has supported, namely individuals convicted of some of the most serious crimes charged in relation to January 6th, such as seditious conspiracy and violent assaults on police officers. The defendant has chosen to publicly and vocally support the January 6th choir, a group of defendants held at the District of Columbia Jail, many of whose criminal histories and/or crimes on January 6th were so violent that their pretrial release would pose a danger to the public. The defendant, nonetheless, has financially supported and celebrated these offenders, many of whom assaulted law enforcement on January 6th, by promoting and playing their recording of the national anthem at political rallies and calling them hostages. Perhaps most importantly, the defendant's embrace of January 6th rioters is evidence of his intent during the charged conspiracies, because it shows that these individuals acted as he directed them to act. Indeed, this evidence shows that the rioters' disruption of the certification proceeding is exactly what the defendant intended on January 6th, And finally, evidence of the defendant's statements regarding possible pardons for January 6 offenders is admissible to help the jury assess the credibility and motives of trial witnesses, because through such comments, the defendant is publicly signaling that the law does not apply to those who act at his urging, regardless of the legality of their actions. In that same legal filing, Jack Smith tells the court that he plans to reach back to Donald Trump's false statements about elections beginning in 2012. Quote, the government will offer evidence reflecting the defendant's historical record of making such claims. For example, as early as November 2012, the defendant issued a public tweet making baseless claims that voting machines had switched votes from then-candidate Romney to then-candidate Obama. During the 2016 presidential campaign, the defendant claimed repeatedly, with no basis, that there was widespread voter fraud, including through public statements and tweets. The defendant's false claims about the 2012 and 2016 elections are admissible because they demonstrate the defendant's common plan of falsely blaming fraud for election results he does not like, as well as his motive, intent, and plan to obstruct the certification of the 2020 election results and illegitimately retain power. Jack Smith's filing also quotes Donald Trump's refusals to commit to a peaceful transfer of power when asked about it before the 2020 election. Jack Smith notes that when Donald Trump was asked in a press conference in September of 2020 if he would, quote, commit to making sure that there is a peaceful transfer of power after the election, the defendant responded, well, we're going to have to see what happens.